Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Camino Church Lessons podcast. We hope that you've enjoyed our journey through 1 John so far, and especially our time with our guest on the last podcast, Pastor Rusty Price. What a great time and what great insight from his experience and from his theology. So we're going to continue on with the epistles of John. We're going to cover 2 John this session. We're going to cover 3 John, and then we're going to do the book of Jude. And the reason we're including the book of Jude is the theme within Jude kind of follows, not kind of, actually it follows through with what John is writing, and will show us that there are multiple writers who are dealing with the same issues during this growth of the Christian church. So today we're going to talk about 2 John. We're going to do some overview over it, and then we'll read through it. It's a short letter. It and 3 John are short, and they're actually, believe it or not, the shortest letters in the New Testament. Each one is less than 300 words, and you may wonder why, because these things are going to go very quickly. There's a lot of information packed in it, but they're not, again, they're very short. There's not much to them as far as length goes. But think about this. If you're writing in the first century, you do not have access to paper like we do. You're writing on papyrus. And papyrus is a type of paper made out of reeds, like the reeds you would find beside a lake or a pond, and in this case, possibly even the Sea of Galilee, as it were, that are taken, they're flattened out, they're pressed, and then they're kind of dried, wetted and dried together in a crosshatch pattern so that they form a piece of paper. So having paper is no small task, and so you make good use of it. So both of these letters would have fit on one sheet of papyrus. So the information's important, but it's not so much that you're going to quote-unquote waste paper. So 2 short letters. And the primary purpose of 2 John is to build on 1 John. And then it's to warn the readers, if you remember, of these itinerant missionaries, these itinerant proclaimers and pastors who are going from church to church to church, and they're teaching an incorrect theology, specifically about Jesus Christ, the humanity and divinity of Jesus Christ. And so they are deceiving the church members, and in this case, church members who are important to John because they're part of his community. And also like 1 John, we'll find in 2 John, there's a secondary purpose, and that is he is going to remind the readers, his audience, of the command to love one another. The same love which they were taught and received at the beginning of their faith. So this is clearly a huge theme in John's life. And as he writes this in 2 John is a much more typical letter for the Greek times, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit about how it really lines up with letter writing at the time. But it is a letter of advice and counsel. He is trying to tell them what they need to do in a way that can make their future better. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. But he's writing from kind of the perspective of maybe a friendly superior, if you will, if I can use that term, superior in that he is far more knowledgeable and experienced with the gospel and the theology of Jesus Christ, but he is doing this in a way that is encouraging. He is not berating them, as he did not do in 1 John. He is not talking down to them, but he is being real clear about what they need to do. Now, I'm talking about 2 John as if John, who wrote the Gospel of John, and John, who wrote 1 John, also wrote this letter. And there's dispute about it. There has been since the earliest of times, because when we get to read the letter, you're going to see that he refers to himself as the elder. If you remember in 1 John, the author doesn't refer to himself at all. He doesn't describe who he is, and we had to kind of piece together what we think of the authorship. Here, the term "the elder" is used at the very beginning of it. So there is actually external evidence that there was someone named John the Elder who is from Ephesus. And remember, we think that the 1 John was written from Ephesus, so maybe 2 John is too. That lived at the same time. John is not an unusual name at all. during this time. And so there could have been multiple Johns in the Ephesus area. And there's at least some external evidence, and it's kind of compelling. And it comes from Eusebius. Eusebius is one of our ancient fathers that we've referenced in the past. Bishop, eventually becomes the bishop of Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast of the Holy Land, the coast of Israel on the western side at the Mediterranean Sea. Great place to go, by the way. It's a national park. If you ever do a trip to the Holy Land, you got to go see Caesarea by the Sea because so much happened there related to the Christian faith. And Eusebius is writing somewhere in the late 200s to early 300s, and he references a statement by Papias. We talked about Papias with 1 John. Papias is a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp is a disciple of John. So there's a close relationship. Papias, as we mentioned, becomes the bishop of Hierapolis, and Papias is living somewhere around 60 A.D. to about 130, we think. But Eusebius references a statement that Papias makes that there's a different John who writes 2 John, John the Elder, who is living again in that same time. And that is such compelling evidence that when Jerome, who is translating the Bible later on, when he translates it and writes commentary, he agrees that 2nd, 3rd John are written by a different John. So very compelling evidence. These are, again, mighty fathers in the church. However, we also need to keep in mind that 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John have very clear similarities. Word usage, thematic consistencies that we have to pay attention to. For example, in 2 John, the elder is dealing with the exact same situation reflected in 1 John, right? Same issues of false teachings, probably the same false teachers even speaking here. Secondly, he calls them Antichrist. And if you remember, that term does not get used in the New Testament except in 2 places. 1 John, 2 John. It is not a term in Revelation. It is not a term that Paul uses. They use different terms. But 1 John emphasized that these false teachers were the antichrists that were already among them. Well, 2 John picks up on that same theme. So at the very least, whoever is writing 2 John has either read 1 John or studied under that author. But the use of it here, being consistent with 1 John, kind of maybe lends us to think that it's the same author who wrote 1 John. Third, this elder stresses the importance of that love command that we've already talked about. And then in fourth, the elder writing 2 John says that he finds his joy in seeing his children walking in the truth of the gospel, which is what 1 John says. So, here we have this tension between what the ancient fathers determined and then the internal evidence of the letter. So for the purposes of this particular study, let me just go ahead and say that I have adopted and hold to the view that it is the same John who wrote 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, John's Gospel, and Revelation. And the reason I do that is I'm giving greater weight to the internal evidence than to the tradition. And you can fall on either side and make a great argument, but it just kind of gives you a glimpse of how you have to go through and determine some of these issues that are not clear, and then let me kind of tell you where I fall, and then you decide where you want to fall on this. Do your own study. And that's the great thing about Scripture is we can all study it if we study it well, and we can come up with our own conclusions about such matters. So who is the audience for this letter? It's kind of addressed, and we'll read through it in just a little bit, but it is addressed to the chosen lady and her children. In the Greek, it's eklekte kyria, chosen lady. And there's been quite a bit of argument on who is this chosen lady, and there's really probably 5 options that we can work from. One is it may be a particular person named Lady Electa, which wouldn't be necessarily an unusual name, someone probably from the Babylonian orientation, because that's what the name would reflect. It could be kind of a noble lady. The noble Kyria is a possibility. It could just be a term of affection. Dear lady. I'm writing to a specific person, and I am calling her dear lady. And remember, in 1 John, we saw the term dear children used multiple times because of that affection that John has for his Johannine community that follows him and learns from him. It could be the church. That would not be unusual at all because the church is referred to as the bride, as the wife. It can be, Israel is referred to as the bride, the wife, the elect. And if it's the elect lady and her children, then the children could either be other churches or the members of the church. So on this one, I kind of go with it's a reference to the church. I think that's not an unusual term. You have a lot of bride of Christ language throughout Scripture, mostly in the New Testament, but even in the Old Testament. And I think that's a fair adoption for what John is trying to say. The issues that we come across in 2 John do not seem to speak to a particular person's situation, unless that person is leading a church. But it seems to speak to the church at large. And when it talks about her children, at least in this case, I'm going with that's the membership. And you'll see that when we come across that term as we read through it. The opponents are the same as they were in 1 John. It's these false teachers. And they've come and they're described as those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as having come in the flesh. And so they are again called these antichrist. And what's interesting as you get into 2 John, because it's reflected in 1 John as well, is that these are people who seem to have run ahead and changed the teaching of Christ. They've gone ahead of what the tradition is in the theological study, and they're making up their own stuff, and they're going as itinerant proclaimers from church to church to church, and they're proclaiming this message. As we mentioned with 1 John, they may be getting paid to do this, but that is not at all unusual for public speakers in the first century. They are compensated if the audience loves what they are saying or agrees with what they are saying. And so they may be doing it for the income. Maybe they believe what they are proclaiming. We don't know, but we do know that their proclamations are doctrinally false. It's a mixed bag of what Jesus taught blended in with some mystery religion beliefs, blended in with some Greek beliefs, and we call that, again, syncretism, where you blend together multiple beliefs to come up with a new belief. And this is, again, what John is writing to these folks, these churches, on his behalf. So he is telling them in this particular book, one of the things you should not do is welcome them in your home. And we heard that in 1 John because they had no place to stay. There were no hotels like we have. There were inns, but it was a different kind of setup, and those were usually not a safe place to hang out. They were known for their treachery. So you would find a host in the church, and they would bring you into their home, which meant they would cover your cost, and it also meant that they agreed with your theology. And John's going to tell them, do not welcome those folks. Do not show them that level of hospitality because they are false teachers. Not that we shouldn't be hospitable. We should. And John doesn't abandon that concept. He's just saying for this particular people, don't do that for them because you're lending to their success, and we don't want that. It is, again, a time where the gospel is being formulated. We're trying to understand what it means for this new and growing church, and John has got to make sure that it does not get off track. So when we look at the structure of the letter, I mentioned that this is an example of a typical Greco-Roman letter. It's actually a real good example of a Greco-Roman letter, and it begins, unlike 1 John, which did not follow the opening greeting format, it does. It has this movement from A to B, if you will, where the people are addressed, and then it moves into a greeting, that grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father that we read in there. And then it moves into an expression of the author's engagement with the people. And in this case, it's going to be the fact that as the author remembers the people, it brings him pleasure. Then when you get to the body of the letter, you're going to get kind of the meat of the matter where he is urging his readers to continue practicing love for one another. He warns them against false teachers and the evil consequences if they show them hospitality. and then the letter closes out with a typical desire or wish for the author. In this case, it's that John wants to be able to see the people face to face, which also may be why he wrote such a short letter. This is a placeholder to encourage and warn them until he shows up. Because once he shows up, then he can spend so much more time training and educating and encouraging you just can't do in a letter. So again, great format for a Greco-Roman letter. You have that initial opening, you have the greeting, you have an expression of care and love, you have the body of the letter, you have a closing, and then it ends with a final greeting, very typical of the time. The kind of the style of writing, which we talked about just a few minutes ago, is deliberative. It is meant to persuade or dissuade, persuade you to do something in the future or dissuade you from doing something in the future to make life better, and in this case, to make their spiritual or faith life better. And you'll see this as we read through the letter, and you're trying to get people to see what's in their favor and what is working against them. And I think John does a pretty good job of doing that in such a short letter. This type of deliberative writing or speaking, because this would have been read, remember, this is an oral time. They're not passing around letters to every person. They are literally reading it from the pulpit or from a main chair or something, and then they're copying the letter and then they're moving it around. So it would be similar to political speeches. The political speeches are very deliberative in nature. They want you to believe something, and they want you to do something out of it. They want you to vote for them. Same concept. You would find that same thing in proposals. If someone is putting a proposal on the table to try to gain business or to win an opinion. Presentations, business presentations, church presentations are meant to influence people. Social justice campaigns that are meant to call you to action. These are all deliberative in nature. And really, when you get down to it, you could almost argue that advertising is also a form of deliberative writing, because they're trying to get you to buy stuff. And if they can persuade you to buy their product and dissuade you to buy from buying someone else's, then they have succeeded. So kind of in the perspective of this, as we look at all the letters that we're talking about in this series, thematically, you've got this concept of bad religion. And in 1 John covered all of the bad religion. In 2 John, he's going to address the bad teaching of religion. In 3 John, we'll get to bad leadership in religion. And then in Jude, we'll get to bad living, the bad ethics of religion. And one of the reasons this is so critical, and it's interesting, it's got to do with civil infrastructure. During this time of Roman rule, there are two concepts that are strong at play in the growth that's going on in the empire. One is the Pax Romana. Pax Romana is the Roman peace. And Rome was very proud of its peace, but it was enforced by strength. If anybody rebelled, they were shut down and they were crushed. And what it meant is that people avoided tension, they avoided turmoil, and because of that, you saw a lot of civilization growth, a lot of people coming into the area. It made good for business, for commercial trade, for art. All these kinds of things are growing at this time, not because Rome was a peaceful people as a government, far from it. They were very clear, they were very harsh when people didn't fall in line with the Roman concepts. So this Pax Romana for the individual person was oppressive, but for culture, it allowed for a great amount of growth. The other thing that stimulated growth was the road system. The Romans were great at building these roads that allowed trade and movement, and so because of that, churches were flourishing for this new Christian people. They were growing everywhere. Small little churches. Paul used churches as his way to do mission work, because that's how he grew the body of believers, is he dropped churches at key places. Always a trade route, always a seaport, something with high population where all kinds of cultures would cross through. And so Paul took advantage of the situation as well. So because of all this, all these house churches are multiplying like crazy, and they're all hungry and thirsty to learn. And so they're welcoming all of these philosophers and preachers into their midst because what they are saying is titillating to the ears. And John is trying to make sure that in all that, they're not listening to the wrong stuff, right? So finally, before we jump into this thing and read through it, because it's going to go quickly, 2 John opens with a benediction. And usually we think of benedictions as something that closes out a writing or a sermon or something. But benediction actually literally means just a good word. It's usually a charge to people, but sometimes it's a promise. And in this case, it is a promise. You'll find benedictions at the beginning of Romans and 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians and Colossians and the Thessalonian letters and the Timothy letters and Peter's letters, even in Jude and Revelation. It is not at all unusual. And in 2 John, we have one at the beginning that is a promise that the grace, mercy, and peace will be with them. And it will come through truth and love. That's how they will gain it. If they abide in truth and they abide in love, then grace, mercy, and peace will come upon them. The more they live in that truth and love, the more they will experience that grace, mercy, and peace. And then they will be asked to give it to others. So let's jump in and read this thing, and we'll comment just a few other things as we read through it. But you now have the background for this letter, and hopefully it's going to help you read it even more. It says, "The elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, because the truth that abides in us, that abides in us and will be with us forever." Do you hear truth repeated like 3 or 4 times in there? That's very important to John. Also, he talks about how he loves them in the truth. And that word for love is agapao. And that is not an emotional love. That is an abiding love. That means you will be there no matter what for people. You are committed to them or to a cause. It's the love that God has for us. Not necessarily a love that ebbs and flows at all. It is undefeatable. It is filled with goodwill for others, and it takes care of a host of problems and issues. Verse 3, "Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love." There's that benediction. So you get that promise of grace, mercy, and peace through living out that truth and love. That is such a good word, not only then, but even now. "I was overjoyed to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we have been commanded by the Father. But now, dear lady, I ask you, not as though I were writing you a new commandment." That should sound familiar from 1 John, and he's going to use commandment. I mean, that's the second time we read it so far. We're going to hear it again. "But one we have had from the beginning, let us love one another." All right? Lived theology. You can't believe it unless you're living it. All right? James would say that. Let me look at your fruit. It's going to tell me about your roots. Right? If we are producing, then we are clearly living that life. Verse 6, "And this is love." He's going to define it for them, "that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard it from the beginning, you must walk in it. Many deceivers have gone out in the world, and those who do not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. Any such person is a deceiver and the Antichrist." Same term used in 2 John chapter 2. "Be on your guard so that you do not lose what we have worked for, but may receive a full reward. Everyone who does not abide in the teaching of Christ, but goes beyond it," remember how we said they're going beyond it? They are moving past it, and they need not do that. They need to hold true to the teaching. "But goes beyond it, does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. Do not receive," this is their instructions, "do not receive into the house or welcome anyone who comes to you and does not bring this teaching. For to welcome is to participate in the evil deeds of such a person." Right? They're paying their cost. They're supporting their message. Do not do that, because those people are not worthy of the hospitality. Although I have much to write to you, we're wrapping up already, such a short letter, I would rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk with you face to face so that our joy may be complete. The children of your elect sister, a sister church, I think, send you their greetings. And then he ends his letter. Man, that is very powerful, very firm packed. I want to give you one other example because it comes from that benediction. And it's that grace, mercy, and peace and how you need to live it and then how you need to give it to others. So let me read this. This is a story about Fred Craddock. Fred Craddock lived from 1928 to 2015. He was an amazing pastor in the faith. He is one that is held up as a model for preaching, and he has written books on preaching. He was the professor of preaching in New Testament at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And in one of his sermons, he tells this story about traveling to Wyoming for a speaking engagement. And he had left. He lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and he had left, and it was warm in Atlanta, and he didn't pack a jacket. So when he got to Wyoming and was picked up at the airport and was driven to this conference, it was a lot colder. But on the way, his friend, as they were driving through some mountainous areas, thought, hey, let's stop at this scenic overlook so Craddock could appreciate the beauty of the Wyoming landscape. And they stopped. And that friend started pointing to some of the mountains in the distance and some of the antelope that were kind of running across that area. And Craddock said it was beautiful, but there was a problem, and it was that he was freezing. And so he couldn't really enjoy that landscape because he was so cold. And as he stood there shivering, a woman kind of walked up to him and said, you know, you look like you need this. And she put her sweater around him. And as he warmed up, he began to better appreciate the beauty that was around him. Right? And he thanked her and he said, let me give it back to you. And she said, you know what? You just keep that and pass it along. So as he and this friend, this driver, were leaving this overlook, this scenic overlook, Craddock noticed another young woman and her boyfriend trying to enjoy the same view. And you could see the same thing happening. She was cold. And so he went up to this young lady and he put the sweater around her. And then he and his friend left. Craddock ended his story by saying that he hoped that that sweater was still at that scenic overlook and that it was still warming up people so they can enjoy the beauty of God's creation. That's the beauty of 2 John's benediction. If I live in grace, mercy, and peace that God has given me, and I share that with others, then they're going to share grace, mercy, and peace with those around them. And isn't that really what we're supposed to do? What a great lesson from 2 John. Next time we get together, we're going to go through 3 John, another short letter, and we'll cover it pretty quickly as well, and then we'll jump to Jude. And we hope you'll join us again. Hey, this podcast is now being posted, so you can go to your favorite podcast place, pull it down, subscribe, and watch us and listen to us. But you can also watch us on the Camino Church YouTube channel. So if you get a chance, go there and subscribe as well, and you can kind of see how this works in action. We hope to see you again soon. Remember, let's stay in the Word, and we're going to keep going on this journey together. Thanks a lot.